Have you ever just looked around your city and wondered, how did it all get this way? Why certain neighborhoods look the way they do? Or how something as simple as a highway can totally redraw the map of a place? Well, today we are unlocking the blueprint of the modern city. This is going to be fun. Let's get into it.
Okay, to really get why this all matters, I want you to look at this number, 70%. The UN projects that by 2050, almost 70% of the entire world will be living in cities. That's a massive shift, and it means understanding how our cities work is more important than ever.
So how in the world did we get here? Well, this huge urban explosion isn't random. It's really driven by a couple of key things that have been happening for a long time, creating the massive cityscapes we see all around us today.
It really boils down to two big movements. First up, you've got urbanization. That's just people moving into the cities, right? They're chasing jobs, opportunities, a different kind of life. But then, what happens when those cities get too crowded, too expensive? Well, that's when suburbanization kicks in. People start moving out of the city center to the areas around it, especially once the automobile came along and made it easy to commute.
And the sheer scale of all this is just mind-blowing. I mean, this growth has created brand new kinds of cities. We're talking about megacities, that's over 10 million people, and even metacities with more than 20 million. But get this, while you might think of places like Tokyo or New York, the fastest growing cities right now are actually in what we call periphery and semi-periphery countries. Think places like Lagos, Nigeria, or Dhaka, Bangladesh.
Okay, so with cities growing this fast, how does anyone even begin to make sense of their layout? Why is the downtown over here and the suburbs way over there? Well, to figure that out, geographers use these really cool tools called urban models. And what's so fascinating is that these models have changed right along with our cities. Back in the 1920s, when you could pretty much walk everywhere, the Burgess model made a ton of sense. But then you get streetcars and trains, and suddenly the Hoyt model fits better. And then the car and the highway completely change the game, leading to these sprawling, decentralized models like multiple nuclei in the galactic city. Here's the key takeaway. When our technology for getting around changes, the actual shape of our cities changes with it.
So let's break these down real quick. The Burgess model? It's basically a bullseye, with the main business district right in the middle. The Hoyt model is more like slices of a pizza pie, with the city growing outward along train lines or main roads. The multiple nuclei model shows that, hey, cities don't just have one center. They can grow around a bunch of different spots, like an airport or a big university. And finally, the galactic model. That's our modern car-dependent city. It's like a solar system with a bunch of edge cities orbiting a weaker central core, all connected by a web of highways.
But here's a really important catch. All those models we just talked about, they're mostly based on North American cities. If you go around the world, things look really different. City models in places like Latin America, Southeast Asia, or Africa often have a whole different structure, mainly because their growth was so heavily shaped by colonialism and its legacy.
And that legacy of division, it isn't just something that happened in other countries. Right here in America, there were specific, deliberate policies that drew lines on the map, creating the kind of segregation and inequality that we are still dealing with today.
One of the most destructive of these was a practice called redlining. Starting back in the 30s, the government and banks would literally draw red lines on a map around certain neighborhoods. The official story was that these areas were high risk for loans. But the reality? It was almost entirely about race. These were the neighborhoods where Black and other minority families lived, and that red line meant they were cut off from getting the loans they needed to buy or even just fix up their homes.
And the craziest part is, even though redlining was banned way back in 1968, its ghost is still with us. Seriously, if you take one of those old redlining maps of a city like Detroit and put it next to a modern map showing poverty, the overlap is it's stunning. Those lines drawn decades ago created a cycle of disinvestment that basically locked inequality into the physical layout of the city itself.
But wait, it gets worse. At the same time, you had this predatory practice called blockbusting. This is where real estate agents would intentionally stir up racial fears. They'd go to white homeowners and say things like, hey, a Black family's moving in down the street, your property values are going to crash. It was a scare tactic to get them to sell cheap, and it worked. It fueled what we now call white flight, a massive wave of white families leaving the cities for the suburbs, which of course just reinforced segregation even more.
Okay, so you have to see how all this connects. You have decades of redlining and disinvestment in certain neighborhoods, followed by white flight. All of that set the perfect stage for one of the most controversial topics in cities today, gentrification.
So what exactly is it? Well, gentrification is what happens when wealthier people start moving into those historically disinvested, lower-income neighborhoods. They start buying up property, fixing places up, and pretty soon,
Property values and rents start to skyrocket, completely changing the feel of the neighborhood.
Now, this is where it gets really complicated, because there are two sides to this coin. On the one hand, gentrification can bring in new businesses and more tax money for the city, which can mean better parks and schools for everyone. But, and this is a huge but, the downside is very real. Rising rents push out the longtime residents who built the community in the first place. The whole cultural fabric of a neighborhood can be erased, displacing the very people who made it special.
All right, so we're facing all these massive challenges: sprawl, deep inequality, the double-edged sword of gentrification. So, what's the solution? How are planners trying to build better cities for the future?
One of the biggest answers is something called smart growth. The whole idea is to fight back against endless sprawl. So instead of building separate zones for everything, you create mixed-use areas where homes, shops, and offices are all together. You design neighborhoods for people, not just cars, so they're walkable. You make sure there are different kinds of housing options for everyone, and crucially, you protect natural spaces from just being paved over.
There's a related idea called new urbanism. Think of it this way. If smart growth is the big picture policy, new urbanism is all about the design of the actual neighborhood. It's focused on creating those dense, walkable, often beautiful neighborhoods that have a real sense of community, kind of like you'd see in an older European city, all built around great public transit.
And one of the most powerful tools for making this happen is something called a green belt. It's exactly what it sounds like, a ring of protected, undeveloped land, like parks or farms, that goes all the way around a city. By law, you can't build on it. It creates a hard stop, a physical barrier that prevents sprawl and keeps nature right at the city's doorstep.
So when you put it all together, from the models that show us how we got here to the new ideas that could shape our future, it all comes back to this one huge question. As our world gets more and more urban, the real challenge isn't just about building bigger cities. It's about how we build better cities. How do we make them more fair, more sustainable, and ultimately more livable for every single person who calls them home?